Elevate your happy hour at the Library of Congress, which is open late on Thursdays for Live at the Library. Enjoy cocktails in the iconic Thomas Jefferson Building alongside live music, author talks, exhibits, and more. It's all free, eclectic, and inspired by the library's collections. On deck for August are outdoor film screenings, a K-pop night, and folk concert with Amanda Pascali. Plan your next night out at loc.gov/live.
Today on CityCast DC. Many people don't realize that the DC region sits on Indigenous land, but recently, one local tribe made history by reclaiming a piece of its ancestral homeland after centuries of displacement. Washington Post reporter Dana Hedgpeth, an enrolled member of the Holowesaponi tribe of North Carolina, has been covering the Pamunkey Tribe's return to Windsor Shades in Virginia. She joins us to explain why this historic land return matters, not just for the Pamunkey, but for the Native communities across the DMV. If I sound unfamiliar to you, that's because I am. I'm Tristan Espinoza, a proud Osage journalist and a new reporter at CityCast DC. Today is Thursday, August 13th. I'm Tristan Espinoza. Here's what DC's talking about. So Dana, many people don't realize the land we live on in DC is Indigenous land, home to tribes including the Nacoochtank, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey people that we're talking about today. Before we get into your reporting, can you introduce us to the Pamunkey Tribe and why they're such an important part of this region's history?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Tristan. And let's back up and rewind a little bit and do a quick history of the United States and of land. If we were to look at a map, what we now call the United States of America is all Indigenous land, right? Natives were the very first peoples. They are the true first people, Indigenous inhabitants. This is all ancestral homeland that we sit on today. And in Washington, D.C., some of the points in D.C. that are so well known were very important spots historically to Native tribes, where the Supreme Court sits, where the U.S. Capitol now sits. Those were sites that were higher in D.C. because D.C. is built on a swamp. They were lookout points for all of these tribes that you mentioned, where Nats Park now sits, a very popular destination in Southeast D.C., was a point where canoes were built and sent down the river. This is Native country right here in the nation's capital. I say this to young folks and old folks all the time when I start speeches because remember, you are on Native land and the most powerful city in the world. This is Indian country right here in the DC region. The Pamunkeys are a part of this history in a very large way. Their footprint was quite large in historic times. And the fact that they were able to buy back property that was, again, theirs. This is a movement that's happening all across the country. It's usually called land back. Mixed feelings about that term. Are you really getting land back when it really was your land all along? But that's where we are now, where tribes are starting to do this, and they're an example of that.
And your story centers on Windsor Shades in King William County, Virginia. How was this land taken from the Pamunkey peoples, and how much land exactly are we talking about?
At one point, they had a huge swath of land that was their territory. Unfortunately, fast forward in history, due to war, due to loss, due to broken treaty promises, this land was lost. It was, in fact, given to an English settler as part of his conquering of the Pamunkeys at that time, what was known as land grants. So they lost it decades ago. It then became a plantation at one point. Then it fell into private hands, into private ownership. And the Pamunkeys, like some other tribes in the Virginia area, were only state recognized. They were in a very long push to get their federal recognition and got that about 10 years ago. And as you know, Tristan, it's sort of like trying to think of a comparison that our non-native readers would understand, which it's like going from the junior leagues to the big leagues in a way. Not to say that state-recognized tribes, including my own, Halawa-Saponi, North Carolina, don't have recognition, but you're playing on a state level versus a federal level. And to get that recognition brings you two big things. It brings you, A, recognition by the federal government. You are a nation to nation. It is the United States' responsibility to negotiate with you as if you were another country, say Germany, Spain, China. You are citizens of that tribal government. You actually carry a citizenship card, as you know we all do when you are federally recognized, and even state-recognized tribes have issued that. So what that did of getting that federal recognition for the Pamunkeys is it elevated them to another level where they were able to have the capacity and the financial resources and get the expertise to buy back their land. When you're only state recognized, it's very hard to provide for the needs of your citizens, education, healthcare. Tribal governments provide tons of services, just like DC government does when we pay taxes, or a county government or a state government. They have a responsibility to provide services for their citizens. When you have a smaller budget as a state recognized tribe versus a federal recognized tribe, you have more pot of money to do things. So that was a big turning point for them to be able to go after a land deal like this and buy back their land. In reality, we're talking about a small portion of land. It's only 13 acres, but 13 acres with a huge amount of meaning behind it. They're not the only ones who have done this. The Rappahannock tribe, one of their neighboring tribes, also in their homelands in the Virginia area, they've done this on a larger scale. They've bought almost 500 acres back now at Fawn's Cliff, overlooking the river named after them, the Rappahannock River. And buying back the land is a form of service in a way. You can touch it, you can see it, but it's also a sense of pride, Tristan. Native pride is a hashtag that you know very well that trends on social media. Why does this trend? Because people have a pride in showing who they are. For too long, so many tribes, especially in Virginia, there were literally laws and rules where people were either considered Black or white. And natives were called mixed race or just sort of undefined. And people were judged by the color of their skin, not just judgment, but also literally laws. And so this is very common among East Coast tribes, especially in the DC area, where they literally hid their identity. And they were so afraid of losing their land, their rights, what few rights they had, that they let it go for decades. Now we have generations of people that are starting to lead the charge of buying back their land, working for their tribes, but there's a gap in knowledge, and they're playing catch up in a way. There's some deep, deep history here of tribes in this DC region. People think, Indians, there's no Indians east of the Mississippi. So not true. All this land was ours, and some of the richest stories come from this East Coast area. Remember, we're talking about land where some of the first 13 colonies that started this country, where Virginia is home to Virginia colony, right? That's where the colonists came. That's where the settlers were. This is the land of Jamestown. Jamestown, before it was Jamestown, founded by the English settler, was home to Powhatan, one of the most important tribal chiefs on the East Coast who had an empire, literally, of territory that stretched huge for thousands of acres in this region, okay? Powhatan, while that might not be a household name to most people, they will recognize this name. Powhatan is the father of Pocahontas. Talk about power, Tristan. Let that sit with your readers for a moment, okay? That's power right here in Virginia, barely an hour's drive outside of D.C. This is, again, rich with Indian history here.
I love that you said that, because we're in a time that people are finally understanding that Native history is U.S. history. And I also love that you touched on these definitions. Like, you and I both know there's crazy conversations around blood quantum, but also just in census data. Whenever we have to click, we're not only American Indian on a data report, we're also Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, always lumped into one. So in terms of definitions for listeners, one thing I wanted to ask you quickly was, I want to put listeners in Windsor Shades. What does it feel and look and sound like?
Windsor Shades is a really interesting place because it has been very well preserved. While it was in private ownership for decades, The real estate agent who handled the deal from Long and Foster told me that in all of her years of doing historic properties, what stood out to her was the incredible condition of the buildings and the land. They respected the land and they kept it with the traditions that went through of the times. At one point, what's so interesting about it, I found out in the history, is that there was a tavern actually in the basement, as in get a pint of beer kind of tavern. And George Washington frequented the tavern and wrote a dozen entries in his diaries of going to there. There was a ferry there that went across the river. Lafayette famously took troops on to the Battle of Yorktown, and they crossed at this ferry, okay? I think Dottie probably said it best, the real estate agent, that you can really feel the history is alive there. And you think of the generations of people and the different types of people who've walked those lands. As cheesy as it is, if walls could talk, the stories that that house would tell would be incredible, right? It is a house that just has stood the test of time and thankfully has been well preserved. And the Pamunkeys plan to continue that tradition of keeping the property in its condition, but also bringing back some of this untold hidden history that isn't known about it. You drive down there and it's twisty roads and the road narrows and you get this tree canopy. And my heart always skips a little bit of a beat because it reminds me of where I'm from in a way. And it's beautiful country. You don't meet too many other cars. And my heart skips a beat and just gets a little excited because, again, it feels like Indigenous land. That's sort of an emotional roller coaster, right, Tristan, of the sadness of history. To me, it is sad to have lost that land, but the power and the excitement to get that land back. How lucky are we to live in a time where we get to see that land coming back to tribes like the Pamunkeys, like the Rappahannocks. I've walked the Rappahannock River with Chief Ann Richardson, who has worked very, very hard to do the same thing. Incredible times that we live in, to see Native people gaining back their power. Land is power. We know this, Tristan. There's nothing more precious to Native people than their land. Why? Because you can't create more of it. There's an infinite amount of land. And why did white settlers want that land? Because you can't create more of it. And he who holds the land holds the power. So when people do hashtag Native power, that is not just words. That's a deep message there that's saying something. And it's saying that bit by bit, Natives taking back that land as it should be, in my opinion, that it is righting a wrong.
100%. And I really, really love that you touch on this feel of what it means for Natives to be on Indigenous land. There's a certain feel to being on Native land. I know when I go back to my tribe, the Osage Nation, being a Pahuska in Fairfax, it feels like you're coming back home. Like it feels like you're more free, you're happier. There's just something to being on Native land. And with that, the Pamunkey chief, Kevin Brown, called this more than a real estate transaction, that this land was an act of historical recognition. As we hear the phrase land back more and more, something the Pamunkey Tribe actually did, can you walk us through how the tribe fought for Windsor Shades and how they ultimately got it back?
So for the Pamunkeys, getting back that land has been quite the journey. This land goes back in their history thousands of years. So often I think people think, oh, the native, quote, native story starts out west. It really doesn't, right? The settlers came to this very area of the DC region. Virginia was one of the first colonies. And guess who was here first and had been surviving and thriving and creating a political system, an economic system of trade? Native people. And who were those people? They were Pamunkey. There's archaeological evidence at this very spot, Tristan, on Windsor Shades that they just bought back. Real archaeological evidence done by experts showing that they were living there. This was a community, a thriving community. Thousands of years. We've had chiefs living there, and John Smith, the famous English explorer, wrote on one of his most famous maps of Virginia, where he mapped going along the rivers, that this was a king's house. He called it air quotes. That was how he described it. For the Pamunkeys, this place, Windsor Shades, was a spot where their tribal chiefs historically lived. Generations of tribal chiefs who descended from Powhatan, who was one of the most famous and powerful chiefs on the East Coast. They lived there with their families and with their families' children. And around them, as was their tradition, Pamunkey communities helped produce food, and they paid tribute to the chiefs and to their families. This was a house that was bigger than others, and in John Smith's English translation, he called it a, quote, king's house. To us, to Native people at this time, this would have been the house of the tribal leader. Obiyankanich, who was one of the younger brother of Powhatan, lived there at one point. This has rich, deep, indigenous Pamunkey Nation history here. It is not just a piece of land that, oh, quote, the English John Smith settled. Guess what? Native people were here long before that. So fast forward, and Ashley Atkins Spivey, who's a well-documented historian, archaeologist, and also a Pamunkey citizen, one of her researchers on her team is on several historical boards, and she learned through a fellow board member that the private owners, the Fishers, wanted to sell Windsor Shades. They had owned it since the 1990s. And as you know, Tristan, I'm chuckling because the news travels fast in Indian country, right? You tell one Indian a secret, as my mother will say, but in an hour, 8 Indians will know it. In a good way. But she shared that information with Ashley, and Ashley got her Chief Brown, involved, and they were able to reach out to their real estate agent and to broker this deal before it ever actually went on the market and buy back 13 acres for about $2 million of their homeland, their ancestral homeland. I used to cover commercial real estate back in the day here at the Washington Post, and I can tell you land deals are complicated. And when this site is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, that makes it even more complicated and hard to deal. That was incredible lead work by the chief, by Ashley, by her researcher, by the real estate agents who were involved. They were fortunate that this worked out in their favor, and we're seeing more of a trend of this, where tribes are able to buy back land that's theirs. I struggle with the word buyback because, again, you're not really... This originally was their land, and to me, it, in a way, should not have been taken. We know how history turned out. I think Ashley teased me of saying, in an ideal world, Dana, sure, this land would be given back, but this land is valuable. It has a price tag to it. It could have been developed. The private landowners had every right to do that within the historic restrictions of it. It could have been developed. It could have been turned into an Airbnb, right? Nothing against Airbnbs, but it's a beautiful house. It's been well restored. It's on the river. It is in a gorgeous location that people would have paid big money for. So it really is an impressive business deal in a way as well, that all these factions were able to work together and to negotiate, and in a relatively short amount of time, get back this parcel of land. They've really made it come full circle and really made a historic moment here.
Here is something from our sponsors at the DC Department of Behavioral Health. DC is turning a corner, and the numbers back it up. Fatal opioid overdoses dropped 33% in this city from 2023 to 2024. That's not just data, that's real people, real families, still together. But the work isn't done, and neither are we. If you or someone you love is struggling, help is closer than you think. Text LiveLongDC to 888-811 to connect with treatment, housing, and recovery support right here in the district. Free Narcan is available at nearly 40 locations across DC because nobody should lose someone for lack of access. And if you're in crisis right now, call or text 988. Know your worth, know your alternatives, know your value, know yourself. Recovery is possible. Find out how at knowyourpathdc.com.
So I do want to know, has there been any comment from Virginia's governor about the land being bought back?
I did not hear back on this specific story, but she has done deals with the other tribes. of putting land in trust in Virginia. So I think this is on her radar of recognizing Indigenous peoples, and that this land was originally theirs. Buying, selling land is not an easy process. It doesn't happen with a quick snap of the fingers. But just earlier this summer, the governor of Virginia, she signed an agreement that put about 20 acres of land in King William County, the same place where the Pamunkeys are, back in the hands of the Mattaponi Indian tribe. That land had gotten into other hands, away from the tribe over decades. And now that land is protected. It's in a state trust, and it's getting back into tribal ownership. So I do think that there is a movement. She's shown it just this summer in signing that deal to get the land back to its Indigenous roots.
That's incredible. Now, I have a more maybe direct question about this, which is murky water, as you and I both know. So I don't know if you want to touch upon that. But what, in terms of comments, has the Department of the Interior or the Bureau of Indian Affairs said about this moment? Did they have a role in any of this land reclamation?
I didn't hear directly from them on this story, and I will be honest, I did not directly reach out to them on this story. I think one of the interesting things about the land back movement that this deal shows is you don't always need to wait for the federal government. No disrespect to the federal government, but tribes are getting the power, the capacity, and the resources to do this themselves. We all know the complicated history of tribes and the relationship with the federal government over centuries. It doesn't matter who has been in the White House or who has not been in the White House. Since the days of George Washington, there has been very complicated, intense relations with the federal government and tribes. Again, it goes back to in simplest forms, we had something that they wanted, land, and it's a finite number. You cannot make more land in this country. And so it has long been a very complicated relationship. I'm not going to bore listeners or yourself with that. But the point of it is, what's incredible about what's happening with the Pamunkeys and other tribes is you don't need to sit back, twiddle your thumbs, and wait for the federal government or wait for somebody else to do it. But tribes are getting this exciting power and capacity and knowledge to do it themselves. This deal happened without the imprint of BIA or Department of Interior. And lots of land back deals are happening around the country without waiting for the feds to initiate something. Again, not criticizing the feds, not saying they should or shouldn't get involved, but land deals are complicated, and we're now seeing something new happening where tribes in the last couple of years, there's been a wave, a movement of tribes able to do this with their own resources. Instead of sitting at the fort, as we say, and waiting for someone else to figure out the path, it's an exciting time to see tribes get the capacity to do this on their own. The land is already complicated enough. If you sit and wait for the feds, you could be waiting another 150 or 100 years. Get this land back now. So it's a perfect case study of there's a whole movement happening where you don't need to wait anymore for a federal grant or the Department of the Interior or the BIA to tell you how to do these programs or wait for an opportunity. The opportunities are there and tribes are seizing them, and the Pamunkeys are an example of that.
So as far as what this means to the Pamunkey, what are you hearing from both them and tribe leaders and members?
Well, I think there's a huge sense of pride, right? Again, there are Pamunkeys that are older, and I think that there's a sense of reflecting that they have lived through tough times as a tribe that had to leave some of their people had to leave the area for economic reasons, to find jobs, to provide for their families. And now they're seeing a generation of people, 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, that are coming back and getting involved and giving up their time to their tribe. That's a proud moment for them. And then to cap that off with buying back your land. There's a lot of Pamunkeys. I was down there last week for a different story who are feeling a sense of pride. They're very proud of themselves, as they should be, that they lived long enough to see the land coming back to them. And I think some people thought, they might never see that. And knowing the history of land lost, there's a huge sense of pride. I know Chief Ann also at the Rappahannocks. She's a busy woman and visits Washington often, and often spends much of her time in suits and traveling back and forth for meetings to provide for her tribe. I think probably one of her happiest times is showing people the land and walking the Fawn's Cliff that her tribe bought back over the last few years.
So what do the Pamunkey plan to do with their reclaimed land?
I think for the immediate moment, they're sort of enjoying that they were able to get this land deal done quickly before it transferred to private hands. And then they plan to, perhaps they're still sort of considering, this will go before their leadership and members and their chief, but they would like to try to open it up a little bit, not have it in private ownership, but to perhaps have events, cultural events, educational events, to let people know more about the history of it and the cultural preservation of it. So they're talking about some economic opportunities, maybe using it as an event space or partnering with an operator to host wine tastings. Wine tastings become a very big thing in the state of Virginia. The exciting thing is they have a lot of opportunity now that they own the land. He who owns land controls the land and controls what's done with it. So I think they have a lot of really exciting ideas of what to do with it. But perhaps the most interesting one to readers and listeners is that it'll be, in some capacity, I think part of it will be open to the public as a place school groups could visit, people could hold events, and not just talk about, yes, George Washington visited a tavern in the home here, but let's talk about the Indigenous side of history here and how it goes back thousands of years. That's a history that's been untold. So there's nothing but upside and great educational and cultural opportunities that they have there. They have some great ideas of what to do with it, and hopefully we'll be able to visit and see it live.
Yeah, I cannot wait to visit. I hope our listeners go to visit. It looks beautiful, and this is the moment to do it once they're ready. I want to shift from the story itself to the incredible person who reported it and just give you your flowers for a second. As a young Native journalist, it means a lot to interview another Native reporter. In my eyes, you're a superhero. You're one of the few Indigenous journalists working in legacy media. You were there for me at the start of my career. To be here today, to interview you, I'm just frankly so grateful. And on a personal note, I have to ask, as one Native journalist to another, when you see land returned to a tribe after centuries, and you get to tell this story yourself as a Native person, what does that feel like?
I have to tell you, I have been so blessed and I'm so grateful to be a Native journalist at one of the most well-branded, well-recognized newspapers in not just the country, but in the world. Okay, I really do believe every day when my feet hit the floor, I think, wow, it's fun for me to come to work. And I've gotten to a place in my career, thankfully, to good bosses who trust, respect me, good editors. I kind of get to pick the stories that I want to do. I shouldn't even say this, but I get paid to have a ton of fun and to meet people and to learn about things that I don't know. That's the best job in the world. I never have a dull day. If you like banker's hours and leaving at 5 o'clock, this isn't the job for you. But if you like learning about something that you know nothing about, and educating yourself and getting a chance to educate the public, that's what I get to do. And it's really fun. And I'm lucky to be able to tell those stories, and even more blessed and grateful that I get to be at a place that allows me to do that. And at a platform that's well known. I talk so fast and sometimes don't enunciate. And I called someone the other week, and the secretary took my name and phone number, and she said, "Did you say you're with the Russian Post?" And I said, "No, ma'am, the Washington Post." And she said, "I'm sorry, where is that again?" And I said, "Washington, D.C., like the nation's capital." I think people still think at times I'm an intern, even though I don't look like an intern, but they chuckle a bit and say, "Wow, you're going to get this published in the Washington Post?" And I proudly say, "Yes, it's going to be published in the Washington Post. This is no joke. I'm real. Check me out on my website. I've been doing this a long time. I want to tell your story." People say, how much time do you need? I say, as much time as you have. I get paid to hear people's stories. That's what I do. We're storytellers. We're oral storytellers. And the best skills I have are to come and to listen. I'm old-fashioned. I still use pen and paper. I don't record my interviews. And I go back to people and fact-check meticulously because they have trusted me, Tristan, to tell their stories. And what an honor that is, to lay it out there on the table, as my mom would say, and to educate people. One of my kids teases me and says, "What if your people don't read your stories?" I said, "That's okay. My job is to make them as interesting as I possibly can." and to ask myself this all the time when I go into a story and when I leave a story is, when I leave a site meet people, is 2 words: so what? So what? Why should people care about this story? Why should they care about the story of the Pamunkeys? Because this isn't just in Indian history. It's not just Indigenous people. This is all, quote, Americans' history. This is Native history. Don't you want to know the history of the land of where you sit? What was here before National Stadium? What was here before the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the United States? That was a lookout point for Native people, Tristan, for Native people. Long before those justices wore those black robes. You think of that when you walk around the U.S. Capitol. You look around. Imagine. Pause for a moment. I tell my kids all the time. Think of the people here before us. It has a deep, rich history, this country, its lands. And it's so exciting to tell the history of one of the most powerful places in the world. This was Native country. Natives, as a fun fact, used to have entertainment and dog racing in a park on Capitol Hill that people now walk their baby strollers at. I love that story. The Anacostia River, named for a tribe that no longer exists, sadly, the Anacostians. These names are not just plunked by people. They have a deep, rich history. They are named for the people who are the original inhabitants of this land. Maybe the translation is botched from the indigenous languages that they once were, but they have roots. They have strong roots. That's an exciting story to tell. I often get asked, why do you want to tell stories of hardship? I've spent years writing about Indian boarding school survivors, Native Americans who were sadly abused and mistreated. Just because history may be dark, we should still shine a light on it. That does not mean we should run from the past. That's the beauty and the ugliness of history. That is our job as storytellers, Tristan, to still shine a light. We are not trying to make judgments on people. We cannot right the wrongs, but our job is to tell those wrongs so that people know. Just because it was a wrong or it was a bad story, there are no bad stories, in my opinion. They're just stories to be told. Our job is to put it out there, and how people feel about it, that's on them. But at least we've educated them, and at least they took the time to read it. I love the emails, and other people might call it hate mail, but I get emails and letters all the time for people who say, you made me choke on my Thanksgiving turkey bone. And my reaction to a story that I did a couple years ago on the first Thanksgiving, the real first Thanksgiving, from the Wampanoags. Those pilgrims would not have survived had it not been for the Wampanoag tribe. I did that story back in 2021 when the pandemic was first starting. And those people were gracious enough to have me. We did our interviews outside. And they said, people have tried to tell our story before, and they haven't gotten right. And I said, and I'm asking with all respect to tell it again, and I'm going to be different because I'm going to listen. This is their story to tell. The best reaction I got to that was, you made me choke on my Thanksgiving turkey leg, because people said, I thought I knew this history, but what I knew was wrong. You don't turn your back on telling a story because it's a, quote, bad story. You tell it so that people educate themselves. And the only reactions I want from people is, you don't have to like it. All I want to do is make you think. You don't have to like me. It's nothing personal. Just, did I make you think? And if you thought about it or you learned something you didn't know, well, then that's a huge success for me. And that's what we're trying to do here at the Post. That's what you're trying to do at CityCast, is tell those stories. Tell those stories that have been untold for too long. They're exciting. They should be told. And people just, all we got to do is listen.
I can listen to you talk all day. Like, I'm just so grateful to be in community with you. You truly are one of my favorite writers and like a superhero.
Oh my goodness.
And as we both know, though, that Native people have always been storytellers. So thank you for telling the story and for telling yours. And I will always keep reading and listening. And lastly, if there's one thing that you hope DC listeners, Native and non-Native alike, take away from the story, what is it?
To stop and think, when you're on land, whose was this before we were here? Who is the generations before that walked this land? Not just non-Native, Native and non-Native. And think of those stories. We so often get caught up in thinking we were here first, or we built this, we did it best. Just pause for a moment. There are so many sites all around this city and this region that have a rich history. Dig beyond what the markers or posters tell you and learn it. Learn that history, because it's very incredible to think of the widespread breadth and depth of Indigenous history. It's really everywhere. You just have to look for it and listen for it.
Well, Dana, thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend? Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Goodbye.